Hey guys, welcome to Ben Wrenchin. My name is Ben and today I'm wrenching on my 94 Chevy K1500. Today I'm going to be taking care of an oil leak that's coming from the oil filter adapter. To do that, I'm going to do an oil change. I've got a video for an oil change. I'll link it in the description. And for this, I'm going to show a couple ways to do it. You can replace this without taking out the drive shaft, but I'm also going to take out the drive shaft and replace it. So let me show you what my oil leak looks like. With the front jacked up and the rear wheels chalked, I'm underneath the truck. Here's the oil filter. So it goes into an adapter that's got the oil cooler lines that run up to the radiator. And this adapter has a seal right here that is leaking. You can see some oil buildup up there. So that leads me to believe that's where my oil leak's coming from. So this drive shaft is directly below this adapter. There are the two bolts for it. There's one right here and one right there. That's all we need to take off to get this off. And as you can see, mine's pretty dirty. It's got quite a bit of oil and residue all over it. So I'd like to get in there while I'm doing an oil change out that gasket inside that adapter. I've got a new filter and I'll throw in some fresh oil. And while I'm down here and doing this, I'm going to go ahead and change out this front drive shaft. It's just got 4 bolts on the front and some bolts on the back. So we'll take out those 4 bolts. And then in the back, it's just got 4 bolts also. So these back here are 16 millimeters. The bolts up front are 11 millimeters. And I haven't measured those bolts yet to figure out what kind of socket I need. Just 2 bolts on the adapter. So that's really all we're looking at. If you're just trying to do this seal, then you can do it without taking the drive shaft out. We are gonna have to drain the oil. The oil drain plug is a 14 millimeter. And after I take care of this adapter leak, I can clean this up and see where this leak's coming from and start to tackle some of my oil leaks. I'm not leaking a whole lot of oil. I just check the oil before I'm going to change it out. I've driven about 3,000 miles and I've only lost about a half a quart of oil. It looks a lot worse than it really is. So once I clean this up, I can see exactly how much oil I'm leaking over time. I just haven't cleaned this up in quite a while. So the first thing I'm going to do is start the truck and let it get up to operating temperature, and then I'm going to empty the oil out and then we'll get to it. And now that I'm up to operating temperature, I can go ahead and turn the truck off and pop the hood. Take out the oil cap so it can vent when the oil drains out. And I've got my catch pan and everything ready to go. The drain bolt is 14 millimeters. Go ahead and break that loose. And I'll take it off the rest of the way with this drain plug removal tool. And we'll let that drain out. I cleaned my drain bolt with some brake cleaner and put a new crush washer on it. I'll go ahead and reinstall the drain bolt. And this one gets tightened down to 16 feet-pounds. Next, I can take off the oil filter. It should just be hand tight unless you cranked it down last time you put it on. Alright, and we'll let that drain for a little bit too. With the oil filter off, there's the 2 bolts for the filter adapter. I've got a 1/2-inch socket. I put a 13 millimeter on it and it was a little bit loose, so I got this 1/2-inch socket and it feels pretty tight. So I'm going to say these are 1/2-inch bolts. I've got a 3/8 drive ratchet with a small extension, and I can just break these bolts loose. And once I get them a little bit loose, some oil starts leaking out, so I'll let those drain before I take it out all the way. So I'm going to go ahead and take one bolt out all the way, the one that I can't really see very well. And those bolts are pretty damn long. And as I take this one out, I want to hold on to the housing so I make sure I don't drop it. Now this thing's pretty hot, so you may want to get some gloves on. And now I can go ahead and take this out the rest of the way. And it looks like I won't be able to snake it out this way, so I'm going to need to take it over the drive shaft. And there we go, I was able to get it out this way. So you can take this out without taking out the drive shaft. So here's a look at the filter housing outside of the truck. This is where the oil filter goes. There's no gasket here because you've got a gasket on your oil filter. On this side of it, this is where the lines would go to the oil cooler. It actually just has lines that go into the radiator. Mine are plugged up, so I like that. I have deleted oil cooler lines before with no issues. So once you get these off, if you don't like that whole setup, you can just either plug these, or there's also an adapter that comes without these ports. I will link that in the description. The thing I don't like about that adapter is that it has the oil filter coming in through the bottom, and so you can't get a real deep oil filter, otherwise it'll hit the drive shaft. So I like this adapter because the oil filter goes off to the side and you can get a bigger oil filter in there. This gasket here is the one that I'm going to change out. It's a large orange O-ring. The kit that I got is Dorman 82560. I will link this in the description as well. It's got quite a few different things in here. Some of these O-rings are for the oil cooler lines. There's a paper gasket that goes in between the adapter and the bottom of the engine. So we'll get that old paper gasket out, put this one in, and then there is our orange gasket that we are going to use. So before I open that up, I'm going to get this old gasket out. I'm going to clean this whole thing up, and then we'll get that replaced. And I'm also going to take out the drive shaft too while I'm down there. So I'll go ahead and use a pick to get this out. And that was easy. And with that gasket out, I'm ready to clean this up. It conveniently fits pretty perfectly into a coolant filling kit that I've got. So I'm going to clean it up in here. The nice thing about this is it's got a valve on the bottom. I can spray brake cleaner in here, and then I can drain that brake fluid pretty easily. So I'll get all this cleaned up and then put that new gasket on. And that was about the best I could do. This thing is pretty gross, and I don't like cleaning stuff like this. I honestly would just think about replacing this rather than trying to clean it and reuse it. They're not that expensive. You can get one that fits the application that you need. So if you want the adapter that has the filter that goes at 90 degrees, you'll want to get this one. Make sure that it comes with plugs, and you can either unplug these if you need to use it for the oil cooler lines, or you can just get the same adapter, and then you don't have to worry about cleaning it, and you don't have to worry about if there's any kind of junk stuck in here after you get the gasket in. So that's what I would do. I wished I had done that. So I will find one of these and link it in the description. But now that we've got that cleaned, we can go ahead and get this gasket in here. And this one's the same color as that, but it does not look the same. I'm guessing this bigger one is the one I'm looking for. So this black gasket sits in here really nicely. The thing that I don't like is it doesn't really snap down in there. But that looks like the one that we're supposed to use. It does look to be the same size as this one. Looks actually to be about the same thickness, considering that this one is flattened down from being installed for so long. The problem that I have is that once I get it up in there and start screwing the bolts in, I'm afraid that this is going to move like that. So I'm a little hesitant with this one, but I'm going to go ahead and try it. This is the paper gasket that's going to go on this side of the adapter. So there should be one of these up inside the engine. It's actually a pretty thin piece of metal that's got paper gaskets on either side of it. So I will get this old one out and I'll put this new one in when we install the adapter. So I wanted to show how to get that adapter out without taking the drive shaft out, but I am going to go ahead and take mine out. Obviously, if you're doing the drive shaft too, you want to do this first so that you've got a lot more room to mess with the adapter. But these are just 11mm bolts. The drive shaft turns freely, and so you'll want to grab onto it and see if you can break those bolts loose. If not, you can impact them out, or I've got another trick I can do. So I've got a pry bar. I can stick this pry bar in here and get some leverage through here, and that gives me all the leverage I need to get these bolts loosened. So there's one, and there's two. So those are loose. I'm going to spin this around, and I'll go ahead and loosen these up too. These are really not super tight, which is nice. And it looks like the hardest part's going to be getting my pry bar back out. There we go. And there we go, I got all of them loose. So I'll go ahead and finish taking all these out and then I'll work on the back. All right, there's one side. All right, there we go. All 4 of those are out. So the front side of the drive shaft is disconnected. That U-joint looks pretty rough, so I'm glad I decided to swap this out while I was doing this. And here's the back side of the drive shaft. It's just got 4 bolts. These are 16mm bolts. I've got a 16mm socket on a long extension. So I've got the same problem here where the shaft spins as I try to loosen these bolts out. One thing you could do to solve that is to kick this into 4-wheel drive before you turn it off. And that way this whole thing will be locked. Problem with that is you can't spin it around to get to all the bolts, which is why I left it loose. So now I've just got to figure out how to get my pry bar in there and get enough leverage to loosen those bolts off. There we go. So hopefully that'll be good enough. So I don't like the way that feels. I'm gonna get my impact. All right, I got my pry bar wedged in there and I'm just gonna spin these out with my impact. And that's way easier. All right, and that's the quick way to get those 4 out. If you don't have an impact, you can wedge a pry bar in here. I found it best to wedge it right there, and it's resting on the torsion bar here. You can also rest it on the frame if you don't like resting it on the torsion bar. And then you can use a ratchet with a long extension to get to those bolts. I didn't like how that felt, so I wanted to use my impact. These are pretty solid bolts, so I wouldn't worry about breaking them too much. But now we have the drive shaft completely disconnected. We got all 4 of those bolts out and the straps off the front. And since this drive shaft's got a slip joint, I should be able to just pry on this side and compress that slip joint, and this should pop right out. I'm hoping to find a way to pry on this and just break it free. I guess the first thing to try is to just pull on it and hope that it'll come out. It's likely going to be rusted on there pretty good. I'm going to try to pry on the bottom side of this connection and hope that I can break it free. And one thing I'd recommend doing before you start this is spray some PB Blaster on that connection. Now that I've got the bolts out, I can spray PB Blaster into those bolt holes, and I know that it'll soak down in there. And so I'll go ahead and do that to all 4. All right, now I've got PB Blaster in all 4 bolt holes as well as all the way around. This plate butts up to another plate on the transfer case. And so that's the connection that we're trying to break. So I'll let that sit for a while and then I'll try this again. After letting the PB Blaster soak, I'm going to try to hit the sides with a hammer. And then I'll rotate it and hit the other side. And just keep rotating it and hitting it until it comes off. There we go. All right, so that wasn't too bad. Hey, there we go. So there's a look at the backside where it attaches to the transfer case. It does have these open holes that you could stick something in and try to punch it out through that side. I tried that, but I really couldn't get anything in there. But I did spray some PB Blaster in there. So I'll clean this up and then we're ready to get the new drive shaft on. I'm just using a drill with a brush attachment to clean up this surface. And I'll blow it out one more time. And this is a good time to go ahead and do the same thing on the front side. You can hit this with a red rag to clean up a lot of this oil. I'm also going to spray it with some green cleaner. This is a really good degreaser. You don't have to go crazy with this, but I like to get it in pretty thorough because this is probably the only time I'm ever going to clean this thing. So while I'm here, I can scrape off this old paper gasket. It's really difficult to tell where it's at because it's just so old and pretty much embedded into the surface. So I'll try to scrape as much of this off as I can. I'm just using an old pick. I got this cheap set of picks. I'll link it in the description. But there I can see where I'm scraping through to metal. So I'm gonna have to scrape this whole surface. Hey, there we go, I got under it. There's a big chunk. All right, now it's coming off in chunks, so that's better. Almost looked like it wasn't even there until I started getting big chunks off of it. So I'll keep working on this. Next up is a plastic razor blade. I'll link some of these in the description. So this is probably the best shot I'm going to get of this tedious process, but wherever the gasket is the thickest, I can just get the pick underneath it and get some of these big chunks off. And that seems to be working the best. So hopefully I'm not scraping this up too bad, but I need to get all of this paper gasket off before I can reinstall everything. I'm guessing this is what a dentist feels like sometimes. And like always, I started off really light and now I'm just really kind of going at it because I'm impatient. And we'll check our progress and see how far we've come along. Just clean this up and check and see how it looks now. Okay, so we've still just got this weird area here that is just not scraping off, so I may need to get a metal razor blade. Hey, there we go. I got through it. And I will try a metal razor blade. And as I do, I will say that I'm being very light and very careful. I do not want to score this metal surface, but I do want to get this paper gasket off. So just a little bit of pressure and going real slow. I always try plastic tools first. I really don't like using razor blades like this, but it does go a bit quicker with the razor blade. There we go. So I'm just being as careful as I can and taking my time and trying different areas and then move to another area. One thing you can do is curve your razor blade just a little bit, and that'll help give you something to hold on to and try to keep this surface flat onto the surface that you're scraping. So I will say the razor blade seems like the way to go. So it's a little difficult to get in this back corner, but I think I can do it. Just got this little bit left. And switch back to my pick and see how that does. There we go. The good news is any scratches that we're putting into this are going to have a new gasket to cover them up. But I'm trying to be careful and not scratch it as much as I can. Alright, so I feel like that looks pretty good. I'll go ahead and clean it off one more time. And there we go. I think that's about as good as it's going to get. I would recommend trying out these hand and tool wipes by Ulsa Tools. It's part number 1786, and I was pretty impressed with these the first time that I used them. These really just kind of cut right through any kind of dirt or grime you got on your hands. And after one wipe, I would say that's a pretty good job. Not bad for just one wipe. The pack is of 100 wipes, and I like it because it's made out of cardboard, so it's pretty heavy duty. So I like these. I would try them out. Check them out at Ulsa Tools, and I'll link them in the description. And I got everything cleaned up and prepared for the new drive shaft and the new oil filter adapter. Cleaned this up the best I could. Cleaned all that up. I cleaned up the mess around it too. Took me a bit of time, but it was worth it. It looks way better. That surface looks good. About as good as we can get it. I also, in digging through my parts boxes, found these straps that I had. I knew I had these from when I did my rear drive shaft. It said that these fit the drive shaft. They didn't, and I never returned them, so I still had these on hand. These are the correct straps for the front drive shaft. It's Dorman 81001. I'll link those in the description too. So I'm going to use the new straps. I stole the bolts when I did the rear drive shaft, so I don't have new bolts, so I just cleaned these up real quick. And the filter adapter is cleaned up and ready to go in. I got the gasket on there and the new O-ring, and that is ready to install. And I also have the new drive shaft, so I have compared it to the old one. Everything looks good. The only difference is this side, and it's not a big deal that this one isn't completely round. The bolt holes are the same distance apart, so that's okay. And the new one actually looks a little bit stronger from this side, so I'm okay with that. Now, when I first started comparing these, when I got the new one, I measured them from U-joint to U-joint, and I got different measurements. So I was a little worried at first until I realized that this is a slip joint, and so it doesn't really matter what size it is, it's gonna fit. So I thought I'd point that out so you don't have the same trouble I did where I thought, oh no, I got the wrong part. My old slip joint is actually stuck, so this one doesn't slip at all, and that was probably causing some problems. So all that being said, I am ready to install the new filter adapter and the new drive shaft. I'm gonna go ahead and start with the filter adapter while I got the drive shaft out. If you're not taking out the drive shaft, you can get it in. I would think it'd be pretty difficult because you're gonna have to keep the gasket and the O-ring on there while you get it in, so that would be difficult without taking the drive shaft out, but I'm sure you can do it. I cleaned up the bolts for the filter housing too, so these are ready to install. So I'm going to put both of the bolts through. I've got the O-ring in there, and everything's ready to go in just like this. I've got everything lined up, make sure my O-ring is seated really well in here, and the gasket is on there good. And I know that it's going to go straight in like this, and I should be able to line these bolts up and get them threaded by hand first. I gotta make sure that my gasket doesn't shift. Double check and make sure everything's still in place. And I'll get one hand on each bolt so that when I get this in here, I can start threading these bolts in and hope that I get it lined up right without shifting that O-ring and that gasket. That actually feels really good. Hopefully I went in perfectly straight and got everything lined up. So at this point I can hold this in here and just tighten these by hand and get them snug. Feels good and look good as I installed it, so I will go ahead and tighten these down to spec. It looks like these bolts get torqued down to 135 inch-pounds, which I only have a foot-pound torque wrench, so I set my torque wrench to 12 foot-pounds, and I'm going to see if I can get a click out of these. Long story short, you do not need to tighten these down very tight at all. There's a click. All right, and there's another click. Cool. So I got those torqued down. I really need to get an inch-pound torque wrench, but I got these to work. So those do not get very tight at all. It's got a seal underneath, so it really doesn't need to be super tight, and they were really easy to take out. So next I'm going to go ahead and put on my new oil filter. And I did pre-lube my oil filter by putting a little bit of new oil around the gasket. And so I'll get this on there and spin it on. I did not pre-fill it. Any oil filter that goes in sideways like this, I believe does not need to be pre-filled. You can try to pre-fill it if you want. And as you put this on, you just want it to be hand tight. So that feels pretty good. New oil filter installed, and now we're ready to put the drive shaft in. I did get new bolts too for the back of the drive shaft where it goes into the transfer case. These old bolts looked a little rusty, so I went to the hardware store and got the same bolts. I think these bolts are 7/16-20, but I will link the correct bolts in the description. But I always like to get new bolts whenever I'm changing parts out if I can, so these were easy to get. I also put a zip tie around the front U-joint, so I took all the tape off, but I want to hold those caps on. I do not want them falling off while I'm shimmying this in there and trying to get the back bolts in. So while I'm doing that, while I'm installing the drive shaft and putting the back bolts in first, this zip tie will hold these caps on, and then when I'm ready to install the straps, I can just cut this. And I should also point out that you should put some oil on this O-ring before you put this filter housing in. I did not do that, and now that I thought about it, I kind of wished I would. I'm not going to now because it's already in there, but if I could do it over, I would put some oil on that O-ring before installing this adapter. And I did go ahead and put a light coating of anti-seize on the back of the drive shaft as well as on the bolts. And so I'm going to stick this in far enough to get it through the exhaust. And I'll just rest it on that exhaust pipe, line up the bolt holes, and I'll see if I can start one of the bolts. All right, so there's one bolt started, and there's the second. So hopefully these last two should just thread right in. I need to wiggle it around a bit to get them to thread properly. Feels like it's easiest to rotate it until the bolt that I'm putting in is at this top corner. And in that position, I can get to it pretty easily and tighten it by hand. So I can also reach my hand around the back and kind of lift up on the yoke to try to tighten these bolts a little better. I'm going to tighten each of them hand tight evenly first. All right, now that I've got those tightened down by hand, I'm gonna go ahead and attach the front of the drive shaft, and then I will torque those bolts down after I get the U-joint attached. And now I can go ahead and cut the zip tie. And I can line this U-joint up with the yoke and just slide it right into place. Slide the screws in with the strap, make sure the U-joint's centered. That feels really good. And I can start these two bolts, get those hand tight, and then I can turn it and do the same to the other side. And so I'll tighten these down finger tight as well, and follow up with an 11mm ratcheting wrench. I want to try to go evenly because this strap is a little bit bent from where I tried to use it on the rear, and so I want to get this strap on as evenly as I can and see if that metal will form to the cap on the U-joint. And that looks like it's sitting pretty good now. The torque spec on these bolts is 15 foot-pounds, so that is not very tight at all. So I'll just get them as tight as I can while I'm holding on to the drive shaft. All right, and there's the last one. So I'll go back around and make sure each of these is even. And then I know I'm not going to be able to get my torque wrench in here, so I'm just going to guess that that is about as tight as 15 foot-pounds. The torque spec for the rear bolts is 59 foot-pounds, and that's going to be pretty difficult to get that torque down while the drive shaft is free. So I'm going to go ahead and leave that for now. What I can do is fill the oil and then turn the truck on, kick it into four-wheel drive, and then this drive shaft will be tight and I can torque those bolts down. All right, so I'm ready to put the oil in. I'm using 5W30 based off of the recommendation of my oil cap. And so I'll go ahead and put 5 quarts into the engine. Mine's a 5.7 liter engine, so it calls for 5 quarts of oil with an oil change with a filter change. So what I like to do is go ahead and put in about 4.5 quarts, and then when I run it and check it, it should be about a half quart low, and I can top it off from there. So I like to stop about halfway and get under the truck and make sure there's no leaks. And of course there isn't because there's no oil pressure yet, but I just do that anyway. All right, and there I'm just above half a quart, so I'm gonna go ahead and stop there. All right, so I replaced the oil cap. We will start the truck, cycle the engine, let it run for about 30 seconds to get the oil flowing through the engine. And I'm also gonna kick it into four-wheel drive so that front drive shaft is locked and I'll be able to torque those bolts down. We can check the oil level, top it off, and we're pretty much done. So I'll start the truck. I will jump out immediately to check for oil leaks, and then I'll kick it into four-wheel drive. Oil pressure looks good. No leaks so far. I still got my parking brake engaged, and I'm going to go ahead and put it into neutral and shift it into four-wheel drive. Put it back into park. Let go off the brakes slowly and turn the truck off. Double check and make sure my jack stands. Still got 4 on the floor and no oil leaks yet. Good news. And now check to make sure, yep, my drive shaft is locked so I can torque down those bolts. All right, so now with the drive shaft locked and my torque wrench set to 59 foot-pounds, I can go ahead and tighten down all 4 of these bolts. All right, there's 1. There's 2. There's 3. And there's 4. And I cannot get my torque wrench in on these front bolts, not even with a short socket. So I can just use a regular wrench and tighten these up just a bit and guess what 15 foot-pounds feels like. So I'll go ahead and do that to all 4. You never want to use a ratcheting wrench when you're trying to torque bolts down. It's more just for speed while you're spinning them in. And this last one's going to be difficult to get to, but I think I can do it. And I had to get a shorter 11mm wrench for this last bolt. And I can only turn it a little bit at a time, so that should be good. All right, not too bad. So just to double check everything real quick, I know that I torqued down the adapter and I got my new oil filter on. It is not leaking. I torqued down the strap bolts on the front of the drive shaft and also torqued down the bolts on the back of the drive shaft. So everything's in and everything looks good. All right guys, so the only thing left is to check the oil level and make sure that it's probably about a half a quart low. I like this dipstick because it's got these holes, and so you can see those top 2 holes are open and the bottom 2 holes have oil in them. So it's about 2 or 3/4 of a quart low. which is right where we thought it would be. So I'll go ahead and dump the rest of the oil in, get it off the jack stands, and go drive it. Alright, and there we go. We are done. So I used quite a few tools. I will link a bunch of this in the description, including some of the parts I used, some of the tools I used. But overall, that was really not too bad. So with that, I'm finished. I'm going to go for a ride and make sure everything feels good. But I appreciate you guys watching. Thanks for sticking around through this whole video. Hope it helps. Let me know how your project goes, and I will catch you guys in the next video.